as many of you will know, we have a series of lectures across a wide range of chronologies and regions throughout the year, and this week's we are listening to our early modern lecture. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. John Gallagher, Associate Professor in Early Modern History at the University of Leeds. With a particular interest, he's a cultural and social historian of early modern Britain and Europe with a particular interest in language, migration and education. His research crosses boundaries between British and European history and stretches from the 16th to the early 18th century. He's researched and written on topics from the history of Italian grammar to the Grand Tour and from perfume floods to Mediterranean piracy. John's first book, Learning Languages in Early Modern England, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. He's the co-editor of Historical Journal, a major generalist history journal published by CUP. He's also a member of the editorial board of the Polyglot Encounters book series published by Raffles. This evening, John will engage with linguistic intersections in a lecture entitled Migrant Voices in the Multilingual City. Come on up, John. I'm really looking forward to listening to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much, Emma. Thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone for coming along today. So I should begin by thanking the Royal Historical Society for the invite to join you today. It's a real pleasure, it's a huge honour for me as well. Thanks to everyone who's come along, especially on a warm day when the siren call of the beer garden might have been affecting some of us. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and hear about 16th century London. I'll just check with the noise of the fan. Can people hear me? Okay, down the back? Brilliant. Okay. In London, in October of 1571, Alix Leroy told a story about an argument with her daughter-in-law, Philippine Sénéchal. Alix recounted how, in the middle of the street and in the middle of the day, Philippine had called her a murderer and a thief. Philippine believed that Alix had had her son imprisoned, and so she took her revenge by telling her mother-in-law that she would shame her, crying out in the street that she should hang. Lots of their neighbours had heard the argument, among them a Flemish woman named Françoise Serrault and an English woman called Alice Jones. Both women agreed that they remembered the argument well. They had heard Philippine cry, hang, hang, along with the other insults, and they remembered that the quarrel had gone on for a long time. They also recalled that the insults thrown by Philippine at her mother-in-law were proffered in a mixture of French and English. Alix Leroy and Philippine Sénéchal were both members of London's community of strangers, one of the terms by which migrants to early modern England were known. Both Protestants, it's likely that they were among the many French speakers who had come to England to flee the violence and religious persecution of the French Wars of Religion, which rumbled on between 1562 and 1598. In the same period, London and England was home to significant numbers of Dutch and Flemish-speaking Protestants who fled the havoc and persecution of the 80 Years' War in the Low Countries, as well as smaller but significant numbers of Italian, Spanish and other Protestant migrants who feared the threat of their inquisitions in their home countries. These strangers all arrived in a city which had long been multilingual. The different varieties of English spoken by migrants from other parts of the realm mingled with the languages of other migrant groups, from Irish and Welsh to the languages of indigenous Americans and Africans, as the world beyond Europe made its presence more felt in England. This was a city which ran on talk, where an only partially literate population understood that words had the power to make or break reputations and relationships. It's very exciting and terrifying to me to have Laura Gowing in the audience tonight as we discuss this. The Elizabethan period from 1558 to 1603 represents a migration moment in London's history, a time when a significant number of migrants were arriving in a relatively short period of time. And it's a moment, crucially, for which we have substantial multilingual archival evidence, rich records in French, Dutch and Italian, as well as in English, made by members of these stranger communities, and which attest not just to their presence and their activities in the city, but also to their voices and words. The importance of the spoken word to these strangers and the communities in which they lived shouldn't be underestimated. Because some members of the stranger churches were extraordinarily well educated and had significant cultural impact, it's easy to lose sight of something highlighted by the first minister of the French church in 1561, when he wrote, "This church is small and consists for the most part of illiterate people." That many members of the congregations were deeply religious does not mean that they were confidently literate. Many were reliant on sermons and catechizing to learn the principles of their faith. These were largely communities of artisans rather than scholars, even though those who kept their records and represented the community to the English were often highly literate and highly multilingual. But the records they kept allow us to listen into speech and oral culture, and to think about the meanings and practices of multilingualism for a wide social range of people, many of whom, as I say, were either partly or not at all literate. In this lecture, I want to use their words to explore how multilingualism worked in Elizabethan London, how language created communities, how religious and civil authorities policed multilingual speech, how strangers and native Londoners communicated with each other, and how the city's spaces were shaped by the languages its people spoke. So I want to begin, if I can, by talking about language and belonging. So Alix and Philippine, with whom I began, were members of London's French Church, located on Threadneedle Street in the east of the city. Edward VI had given permission for the foundation of a church for strangers in 1550, and the period after Elizabeth I came to the throne saw the emergence of 3 distinct stranger churches in London. So we see the French church is on Threadneedle Street, indicated by this red line here, in the Chapel of St. Anthony. The Dutch church is here at Austin Friars, and the Italian church they worship in Mercer's Hall on Cheapside. Now, these communities followed the more austere Calvinist strand of Protestantism, rather than the faith and practices of the Church of England. And they catered to this growing community of strangers, so those fleeing persecution, but also many who had been present in London since earlier in the century, as well as some, we might call them economic migrants, who came primarily to practice their trade. Now, these churches were, at least to some degree, communities bounded by language. Their services were held and their records were kept in the main language of each church, though Latin remained as a language of study and communication. So we see some Latin is used interchangeably with Dutch in the records of the Dutch church in the early 1560s, and it remained a medium of written and oral communication between the different stranger churches and with the English religious authorities. When the 3 stranger churches met together to discuss shared concerns, the language they used for their records was French. The stranger churches played host to Latin lessons, counted language teachers among their members, and witnessed intentionally multilingual performances, such as in November 1560, when the elders of the French and Dutch communities met at Austin Friars, just here, to hear a sentence of excommunication, which was pronounced in Dutch, French, and Latin. But questions of language remained contentious, particularly when it came to baptism and marriage. A colloquy of England's French churches in 1587 warned those of the French language who do not understand English at all not to serve as godparents to children. And they said that their members should not ask English people who did not understand French to serve as godparents to their own children. In 1573, the deacons of the Dutch church had ruled that it was improper for English people with no knowledge of Dutch to act as godparents. When the Flemish goldsmith Martin van de Zande asked the Italian church of which he was a member if he might present his son to be baptized in the Dutch church, since the godparents do not understand Italian, his request was agreed to. And similar requests occur around weddings. There are a number of requests to the Dutch church, like that made by Olivier Brasson, who asked for permission to be married in an English church, he said, since his bride was an Englishwoman and understood no Dutch. An agreement drawn in French and Dutch in 1581 stated that the French church would take in any new arrivals to London who spoke the French or Walloon language, while the Dutch church would welcome those, they said, of the High Dutch, meaning German, Low Dutch or Flemish language. So this indicates the important relationship between language and belonging in those communities, but also highlights that they remained linguistically diverse. Even to refer to the Dutch or French churches as Dutch or French speaking, for instance, elides that diversity of languages and varieties that their members spoke. Many individuals would have been partially or entirely bilingual in Dutch and French, while the varieties of each language spoken by different members with different backgrounds would have been noticeable. And indeed they are in the written records in the church's archives. So you can see, for instance, in the records of the Dutch church, how the language shifts depending on the dialect spoken or the variety of language spoken by the scribe. And there's been fantastic work done and done more broadly on the social history of Dutch by Christopher Joby on this. At one point, the French church auditioned a new Flemish preacher, only to turn him away because he simply doesn't have the proper tongue for French. That he spoke French well enough to deliver a sermon in it was immaterial when it wasn't the right kind of French. In 1572, Antonio Giustiniani explained to the consistory of the French church, I'll talk about consistories in a moment, how the Italian congregation contained a number of Spaniards who understood Italian. And in 1598, when the Italians could no longer find an Italian-speaking minister, their members were advised to join either the Dutch or the French church, depending on which language was more familiar to them. So while each stranger church was linguistically diverse, and there seems to have been an expectation of some linguistic flexibility, the ideal of a shared language shaped them as communities. But these stranger churches were not insulated from English. They had English members, and they were frequented by English speakers who were curious about their ways of worshipping or simply seeking to burnish their language skills. The scribes who kept their records gamely transcribed English place names and terms as best they could, so that we find, for instance, the Dutch recording an incident in an alehouse, which is spelled E-Y-L-H-U-Y-S-S, in Holloway, H-O-L-E-W-A-Y, and the French also noting events in une alehouse, this time A-E-L-E-H-O-U-Y-S, in Thames Street. So the memorandum books as well of the deacons of the Dutch church in the early 17th century show that the language of their written accounts actually changes to English when they need an entry in these accounts to be read and signed by an English craftsman, while the bills that were presented to the church for payment in English were then annotated for the archive in Dutch. The archives tend to contain English at moments where the words that are spoken matter themselves, and that's particularly true in cases of insult or conflict. So one of those is when Bernard Lure and Guillaume Noury complained that Gabrielle Aymon's wife had called their wives pocking whore, or when Peter de Bert had seen Englishmen mocking a very drunk Jan the bookseller, calling him drunken Fleming. So they both appear kind of in English in the records of the communities. When a dispute arose between some weavers who were members of the Dutch church and the Weavers' Company, the representatives sent to discuss the problem with the English reported back that their admonitions had been met with abuse, and the church recorded that the weavers, the English weavers, had said to them, "Go your ways, knaves." There you go. If for recently arrived migrants, a shared language could be an indicator of belonging to a stranger church, then rejection of that shared language could indicate separation from the community. In the church's records, English is sometimes used by strangers who wanted to signal their distance or reject the authority of their countrymen. In 1560, a French schoolteacher named Gilles Berail said angrily that he did not wish to be subjected to the authority of the French church. He said because he already paid tax in his English parish and he understands English as well as French. When the French elders visited Denis de Restingham at home to inquire why he hadn't attended the Lord's Supper for 2 years, he accused them of misusing funds that had been collected for the poor, but he made sure to do so in English. In 1572, Olivier Le Neveu was called in to be admonished for the words he had spoken against certain women, and he got into a heated exchange with the minister. Le Neveu wanted to speak, and so tried to interrupt the minister, who told him to wait. To which Le Neveu responded, "I don't know if I will wait, since you speak so evilly." The minister told him to step outside for a moment, at which point Le Neveu, rising suddenly and leaving, said, "God boy," so goodbye, but recorded as G-O-D-B-O-Y-E in these records. With those parting words in English, he left and refused to return, in spite of the minister's urging. And as time went on, English language had other troubling implications for belonging. In 1580, one former member of the Dutch congregation wrote to their minister to say that by a long residence in England, he had lost nearly the entire use of their language. As the 17th century wore on and the stranger churches' congregations dwindled and were increasingly made up of the children and grandchildren of first-generation migrants, their linguistic role shifted to one of defence and preservation of the shared language in the face of English. So I'd like to talk now about policing strangers' speech. The ruling body of each stranger church was called the consistory, and the role of this all-male body was to oversee the government of the church and the behaviour of its members. Each church elected elders and deacons, each responsible for a quartier or a like, a district of the city. In his 1561 text on the organisation of the London French Church, the minister Nicolas de Gallagher wrote that it was important that the elders should come from different parts of the city, he said, in order to have eyes everywhere. In the French church, new elders swore an oath, promising, "I will keep an eye on all those who are members of the church, and especially those who are committed into my charge. I will prevent scandals, procure the peace and unity of the whole church in general, and of everyone in particular. I promise to keep and maintain the honour and profit of this kingdom, and to inform the Bishop of London of anyone who might seek to trouble the peace and unity of England. So one important way in which the stranger church consistories tried to uphold these oaths was through the rigorous policing of speech. When the French church admonished Martin Fontaine's wife for her tendency to swear, she admitted that she had insulted one of the women who had accused her, but that beyond sometimes saying, "by my faith," she wasn't really guilty of any swearing. As part of a long investigation into the conduct of the silk worker Gasparo de Gatti, the Italian consistory found the said Gasparo argues almost every day with his wife and with others of his household, and what is worse, ordinarily he does nothing but blaspheme. The policing of women's speech by the consistories is evident throughout their records, and their concerns over women's tongues seem sometimes equal to their condemnation of men's more serious crimes, as in the case of Pierre Fouret, who was admonished for beating his wife while drunk. In the same breath, the consistory admonished his wife for not knowing how to contain her tongue against her husband. In order to rigorously police the speech of their congregations, the consistories needed to have ears in many places throughout the city. When the Dutch elders took an interest in the parentage of Sandrine Straken's child, they gathered evidence from the mouth of a woman who came from overseas, and, they said, from the mouth of an Englishman. They also took the testimony of a woman who had been present during Sandrine's labour, who had joined the midwife in urging her to say the name of the child's father. The consistories sought oral information of this kind because it was key to understanding ungodly and scandalous behaviour among members of their congregations. But at the same time, the consistories sought to control and quell rumours which spread within and beyond their communities. In early modern societies, rumour was thought of as an almost irrepressible force. It was characterised as running between speakers and hearers, and its spread was cause for concern among the authorities throughout early modern Europe. Rumours in London could bring scandal on a stranger church congregation, so the consistories commonly asked members to account for what was being said by other people about them, as when Tannekin de la Noy answered the Dutch consistory's queries by admitting that evil rumours had followed her which were untrue, and that she was ready to answer for herself against her accusers if they would appear. While the interest in rumour is something we can see elsewhere in early modern Europe, it was particularly important, I think, in these communities, these mobile communities of migrants, many of whom had been uprooted from their former lives and found themselves in England. The consistories expended significant effort in trying to find out if they were being told the truth about people's pasts, regularly investigating whether those who claimed never to have been married, for instance, were telling the truth, or if they actually had spouses or families beyond the seas. Strangers were pursued by rumours and stories, and the economy of reputation and honour stretched beyond London's walls and beyond England's borders. These consistories were careful to regulate illicit speech, in part because they were targeted by it very, very commonly. Their records are rich in moments when the members of the stranger churches attacked their elders and deacons, comparing them to, for instance, the Spanish Inquisition, accusing them of treating congregants worse than heathens and Turks, and signalling their displeasure at the consistory's decisions by yelling "Pope, Pope," in order to accuse them of papistical tyranny. Some strangers were aggressive in their denunciation of the churches and their refusal to live under their rule, like Barbara Michiels, who told the deacons of the Dutch church, "I don't want to come to the church or to the consistory, since there is no justice for the poor there." Or the woman named Leyskin, who said, "I'd rather live with a devil than with people like those from the church." They were especially concerned with incidents where grumblings against the consistory came to the ears of those outside the community, as when Martin van Dale accused the Dutch minister of preaching false teachings, and the records say that this was not only among the Dutch, but also among the English nation. The French church hauled Nicolas Wilpin before the consistory on multiple occasions because, they wrote, "he does not stop spreading scandalous words against the consistory throughout the city." We get a sense of how these words might have slipped between the different communities in the account given to the Dutch consistory of Peter Noppe, when he said that the elders and deacons of the Dutch church were drunkards, whoremasters, and usurers. Noppe's words were spoken in the crowded Three Horses on Mile End Green. The oath taken by the elders revealed that concern with scandal, which threads all the way through the consistory records. In August of 1571, the French admonished a hatmaker called Pierre de la Mare also nicknamed Le Brave. So they accused him of haunting taverns, which is bad enough, but they also cited an incident in a tavern when he put a knife in a pot and tried to make other people drink from it. De la Mare's drunken misbehaviour was bad enough, but the consistory were especially concerned because this was cause for scandal among people who weren't members of the church and who said amongst themselves, and this is what it says in the records, that they said amongst themselves, "Behold the people of the church, behold the reformed people." She's giving them a bad name. The consistories of the stranger churches were painfully aware that their members' presence in England and their rights to worship in a way that differed from the English church were conditional. Even before the congregations came under direct pressure from Archbishop Laud in the 1630s, they were frequently reminded by the English authorities of the precarity of their position and of the religious liberty they enjoyed, but only on condition. And as such, they viewed with real concern any scandals which threatened to draw the eye of the English community and the English authorities. So in November 1569, the Dutch consistory admonished Henrik Knoop for his drunkenness and unchristian rudeness, which had redounded, they said, to the great scandal of the congregation and the English nation. The consistories also had to restrain their members from engaging in the theological controversies of the English church, as when Willem Fogge informed the Dutch in 1571 that many members of the church were speaking evilly and scandalously about the four-cornered bonnet, so the square cap, which the English ministers wear, with the attendant risk of dragging an already precarious community into the ongoing controversy about ministers' garments, which was the source of much rancour among English Protestants of different stripes. Even more concerning were those moments when internal church disputes spilled over into the wider Anglophone community, something which happened more than once amid disputes in the Dutch church about the minister Godfriedus Vingus. One member of the church, Jacob Cart, who we'll meet again later on, described him, the minister, as a false heretic while drunk in the shop of Louis Le Seigneur. When members of the consistory went to Cart's house to admonish him, he had more insults against the consistory to share. He said, "Those from the consistory are all monks." If you want to annoy a 16th century Protestant, call them a monk. And the consistory noted that all of these words were all said in English. In the autumn of 1579, the stonemason Vincent de Koninck, known to his English neighbours as Vincent King, was living with his wife Liskin in the parish of St Leonard in Aldersgate Ward, just a few minutes' walk from St Paul's Cathedral. The pair knew another couple, Hans and Perrine Montenaken, who lived across the city in Aldgate Ward. So bear those names in mind. It was evidently a tense relationship, since Vincent had warned Hans not to show his face at Vincent's shop because Liskin was angry at him. But Hans ignored the warning and came anyway. At the shop, he had whistled and used slanderous words, including calling Liskin a whore. His wife, Perrine, added her own insults to the mix, calling Liskin and Vincent a false whore and a false thief. The couple had apparently come to challenge Liskin and Vincent about what they had been saying behind their backs. But Vincent and Liskin gave as good as they got, and at some point they switched the language of their comebacks to English. Liskin cried out in English that Perrine Montenaken and her husband were people who wanted papistry to be brought back in here. Perrine told the consistency that Vincent and his wife had shouted loudly, again in English, "Look what kind of people they are. Such people are not worthy to be tolerated here." Vincent's wife insulted Hans with a variety of insults, calling him a knave, a thief, and saying it would be better if he were hanged at Tyburn. As the argument escalated, it drew an audience, not only the English gentleman who was in the shop and when it kicked off, but also people in the street outside who had stopped to listen and, we can assume, to gawk. So reconstructing this four-way argument from the consistory records, the picture that emerges from the different participants' testimonies is of a set of decisions. Hans and Perrine came to Vincent's shop as a semi-public space where they could challenge him and his wife. They would have known that others might be present and that an argument would be audible outside in the street. Liskin and Vincent's choice of English for their retorts and the kind of accusations they made, that Hans and Perrine were actually Catholics who wanted to overturn the English religious settlement, that they didn't deserve the toleration shown to Protestant refugees, that Hans should be punished at London's famous execution site. They seem to have deliberately performed to their, in part at least English, or sorry, at least in part English audience, using their language and playing on their prejudices. They cemented this impression when, after Perrine and Hans refused to leave, they called the constable to have them arrested. Vincent and Liskin implicated English customers, passers-by and representatives of the city authorities in a multilingual argument between strangers. They demonstrated a common feature, the records I'm working with here, evidence that strangers, regardless of their level of literacy or education, showed a sophisticated understanding of how insult, slander, and reputation worked, and could switch between languages to make their use of insult and accusation as effective as possible, often in ways that demonstrate a real knowledge of how space, sound, and the distinction between the public and private worked in the early modern city. Encounters like these between speakers of different languages were unavoidable in the context of London's housing and the circumstances in which many strangers lived. Bishopsgate, a ward which housed a high proportion of the city's strangers, was described by the antiquarian John Stowe in his survey of London as featuring many houses which were, of late time, too much pestered with people, a great cause of infection. In 1593, a doggerel poem, which came to be known as the Dutch Church Libel, was pasted against the wall of the Dutch church at Austin Friars. This anonymous screed drew on a variety of well-worn anti-immigrant stereotypes. It accused the strangers of taking work from English labourers, faking their religious beliefs while being secretly in the service of the Spanish enemy, and manipulating the English markets and currency to the detriment of English subjects. But amongst those accusations levelled by the libel's author or authors was one which touched on that question of overcrowding. The author wrote, "In chambers, 20 in one house will lurk." And they wrote that the stranger presence in the city's accommodations was the cause of raising of rents, which was never known before, while our poor souls, that is the English, are clean thrust out of door. The returns of aliens, the surveys which documented the city's stranger population, attest to households and buildings where speakers of different languages lived in close quarters. And Laura Gowing has written about how the tensions engendered by London's combination of high mobility and crowded living could find an outlet in insult, often sexual in nature, and that's certainly the case here. In this context of cheek-by-jowl living, of porous walls and shared staircases, strangers' words and languages were audible beyond the boundaries of the household, meaning that neighbours and passers-by were commonly implicated in conversations and arguments. So arguments and noise and insults continued to trouble the boundary between the public and private. In 1572, the Dutch consistory called in Gerard Artus to address the rumours that were swirling around his relationship with his wife and his maid. They claimed that the great strife and disagreement between them was not private, but public. Artus claimed that since their arguments had taken place in the couple's home, they were private and therefore not public, but a queue of neighbours was ready to testify to the words and the violence that they had been able to overhear. Dirk Schaap, Artus's neighbour, said that the English neighbours had heard it too, and that those English neighbours had said amongst themselves, "This is an honest man who is beating his wife." Incidentally, it's very interesting because honest is the word that appears in that record. It's not a Dutch word. So you get a sense here of the consistory scribe echoing an English vocabulary of moral judgment. Rumours about what was going on in the Artus household seem to have gone back and forth between the Dutch and English-speaking communities. Gabrielle Barth's wife told the consistory that she had heard rumours of what had happened from the English. She had then gone to ask Gerard Artus's wife if what she had heard was true. And the consistory even recorded the response of the English neighbours in a note. They write, "And the English said they had never thought that Gerard would have been such a man." Strangers' neighbours were more than just witnesses to incidents of insult, argument, and violence. The English and other non-members of the churches could be called to the consistories as witnesses. And when a dispute was settled by the consistory, it was common for them to insist that those who had witnessed it would be informed of the outcome. So Lois Coton and his wife Dina were said to have scandalised their neighbours by their argument and their bad way of living. The French consistory insisted that they be reconciled, not only with each other, but in the presence of their neighbours from the church, a man called Jean Dumoulin, who they described as Spanish, and their other neighbours living in the Barbican. In October 1570, the Dutch consistory ordered one member to explain to his English neighbours that he had been incorrect when he had accused another member of being a thief. The public dispute between Michel Ducroc and Jacques Boulanger was brought to reconciliation by the French consistory, with the pair promising to make their reconciliation apparent to the English, their neighbours. The stranger consistories took seriously this work of explaining, understanding, and reconciling disputes which crossed the boundaries of language and community. And this work, I think, was a kind of translation. It required the decisions of the consistory to be communicated to members of the multilingual and multinational communities in which their neighbours lived. The bad words and misbehaviour of strangers could come to the attention of the English authorities, as well as to the consistories of the stranger churches. London's constables, who policed sexual morality alongside other misdemeanours, were frequent sources of information that came to the stranger churches. So when the shoemaker Hans Willems was rumoured to be the father of an illegitimate child, the story came to the Dutch church via a chain of hearsay, which began with a man called Adriaan ten Seneschal, who told a constable in the minories named Lawrence Thomas, who told the elders Matthias Lull and Hans Garst, who brought the information to the consistory. In 1571, just a few days apart, two members of the French church in separate incidents got themselves put in the stocks, one in Aldgate and the other in Whitechapel, both occasions for their drunken and offensive words to the watch. The consistories had to engage with constables, with the watch, and with figures from the Archdeacon of St. Paul's to aldermen, justices of the peace, and the master of the Bridewell prison. Sometimes strangers helped the English authorities with their inquiries, as when members of the Dutch church were ordered to act as translators in an investigation into supposed Anabaptists by the Bishop of London. And these encounters show two things. Firstly, that many strangers had the linguistic knowledge and flexibility to communicate across the language barriers of their adopted city, whether that was to help the authorities with their inquiries or to really stick it to their neighbours. And secondly, it shows that London's civil and ecclesiastical authorities had to work multilingually too, finding ways to surveil and manage the speech of communities whose main language was not English. The consistories were important mediators here, translating between the strangers and those who ruled over them, especially when migrant voices came to the attention of the city's own systems of surveillance and punishment. Strangers' voices were heard all over the city. Clement Wouters' wife was heard complaining of her husband's drunkenness and violence in a Westminster street. Clark and Corbeil's was seen assaulting and speaking threateningly to a woman on London Bridge. There was gossip being spread about the troublemaker Jacob Cart among a company gathered at the Leadenhall. The crimes of Jean Bouquet crossed the city. First, he got into a brawl with an Englishman at a tavern in Bishopsgate, and later he was heard making villainous statements and speaking insults mixed with swearing and blasphemy in Southwark. Public spaces where people gathered to trade, to share news and information, or just to hang around were ideal spots for a row, but also for an accusation. The consistories heard from the widow Versloot how Pasquier Flurkin had called her a perjurious whore in the Guildhall, and how a group of Dutch women had traded insults outside the door of the French church. When Melkin van Aast made statements against Peter Trion in Mercer's Hall, where the Italian church was located, the Dutch church were so concerned about the controversy it had caused among the English and among strangers that they made the participants go back and explain what had gone on to all of the witnesses, including the English. So language shaped urban space. You didn't have to be multilingual or even literate to hear London's other languages when passing through its streets. Some spaces were characterised by their multilingualism, becoming sites where informal and oral translation helped news, gossip and slander spread through the urban speechscape. And space shaped language as well. The meaning and the force of words changed depending on the place where they were uttered. So Londoners, as we know, were experts in the fine art of making a scene. And there were few better places for a multilingual showdown than London's Royal Exchange. Finished in 1568, it's a site of international and multilingual trade and information brokerage. Visiting in 1598, the German traveller Paul Hensner remarked on the stateliness of the building, the quantities of merchandise, and the assemblage of different nations. In John Eliot's Orthoepia Gallica, a semi-satirical French conversation manual published in London in 1593, one character suggests a walk to the Exchange to hear the news out of France. Later, another character says, "I will be below in the Exchange, either walking among the Italians, or trucking with the French, or prattling amongst our English, or carousing with the Flemings at the Cardinal's Hat." And the text reflects and kind of reproduces the different languages of all of those different groups. The playwright Thomas Dekker wrote that in the Exchange, they talk in several languages, and like the murmuring fall of waters in the hum of several businesses, insomuch that the place seems Babel, a confusion of tongues. This exchange, this Babel, was a place where strangers came to trade, to share information, to gossip, and to socialise. It provided an audience for arrests, arguments, and accusations on issues that ranged from debt to sexual assault. And the exchange was witness to political and religious argument between and beyond the members of the stranger churches. It was a site where their collective reputation could be damaged by wayward words or actions. The Dutch church got frustrated with the news that a number of their members were meeting at a silversmith's by the exchange, where they formed a college of drunkards and caused trouble. It was a site for translation of all kinds. The stranger notaries, who translated the wills of migrants, had their glass-windowed offices next to the exchange too. And the exchange was meant to be a male-dominated space, but women made their voices heard there. In 1579, the Dutch consistory heard a complaint from an Englishman named Matthew Field, who had had a Dutchman named Jan Pauwels imprisoned in the King's Bench due to an outstanding debt. Field reported that Pauwels' wife had come to find him at the exchange, where she had accosted him as he left the shop of a man named Geoffrey Duckett, and loudly accused him of unjustly imprisoning her husband. The English witnesses to the incident, who included two of Field's servants, William Payne and Thomas Leonard, stressed that Pauwels' wife's accusations had been made in English. But while the exchange was the cause of frequent frustration for the elders and deacons of the stranger churches, it was also a rich resource for their own investigations. In 1575, the Italian church sent two members of their consistory to the exchange in order to gather information about the life and behaviour of the silk worker Gasparo di Gatti. Di Gatti was reported to have told listeners at the exchange that the Italian minister was a mercenary idiot and a rogue. And digging into witness testimony, the Italians learnt that Gasparo's insults against the minister had been spoken in the presence of Hans Montenaken, who we last met, insulting Vincent and Liskin in Vincent's shop, and they were reported by Francisco Marquina, a schoolteacher and member of the Dutch church who moonlighted as a court interpreter in cases where those involved didn't speak English. Marquina went on to tell the consistory that he had heard Gasparo say that brothels were good and necessary in a republic, and that the authorities should allow them. So Gasparo shows up a lot in the Italian church records. He's a repeat offender, and he was investigated on another occasion for having dealt with a problem with his cauldron by seeking the help of a woman in Rochester, who the consistory firmly believed to have been a witch. And this had sparked a debate among the Italians at the exchange over whether this was Christian behaviour or not. And the consistory carefully compiled the testimony of all of those who had weighed in. One last case handled by the Dutch consistory gives, I think, a real sense of the multilingual bustle of the exchange and the verbal and linguistic strategies that strangers used in this most public of spaces. In August 1579, the Dutch church first heard the rumour of a dispute between Lois Thierry and Pasquier van der Moot. Lois had apparently had Pasquier arrested without going through the consistory first, and there had been public insults and fights between the two men. A version of the story can be pieced together from their statements to the consistory and from the accounts given by witnesses. Pasquier, it seems, had approached Lois at the exchange and accused him of having tried to have him arrested. As they argued, one of Lois's creditors had appeared, and in his hearing, Pasquier had called Lois a number of insulting names, including knave and bankrupt knave, with many other evil words. Now, this is already, again, interesting from a linguistic point of view, because the consistory record these words as knave, a K-N-A-I-F, but that's a word, again, that doesn't exist in early modern Dutch, suggesting that this is an attempt to note, without quite translating, the exact term that Pasquier had used. Knave was an actionable term in English, and Pasquier, like the scribe who kept a record of the argument, knew the power that he wielded when he used it. So we already have a sense of a conversation that's happening on the border between language or between languages. And then we hear that turning to Lois's creditor, Pasquier told him that Lois was a bankrupt and said, Lois is clear at this point that these words were in English, "Don't you owe me £30?" When it came time for Pasquier to give his side of the story, he would agree on these key details, that he had said that Lois owed him money, and that Lois had responded by saying, "You lie like a boy," and similar insults in Dutch and English. When Lois tried to walk away to another part of the exchange, Pasquier followed him, continuing to insult him as he went. Lois went home and began an action against him and had him arrested. So the use of English, to which both Lois and Pasquier attested in their statements, seems to have been intentional on the part of both parties. They knew they had an audience. Jan Godskalk, Claude Dautigny, Jan Selot and Raphael van den Put would all attest to having witnessed the arguments and to have heard some of the words exchanged. They also remembered the physicality, Lois attempting to walk away, Pasquier pulling him by his coat. And they could situate it in the exchange too, with Van den Put and others testifying that this had happened under the galleries, probably one of these sections here, at the noon exchange. The switch to English for the exchange of insults meant that their dispute would be comprehensible, and that the scandal attached to the terms that they used of bankruptcy and moral degeneracy would be understood by Lois's creditor, with likely financial consequences for Lois, as well as by the wider Anglophone public gathered at the exchange at its busiest time of day. Scholars of migrations past and present have considered questions of assimilation, charting how and how far migrant communities integrate into their host societies over time. And what we see in these moments of multilingual insult and reputation management in early modern London is a number of different kinds of knowledge at work. Knowledge of which language to use and how to use them. Knowledge of the social dynamics of a multilingual public space. And an understanding of how honour, credit and reputation worked in the multilingual city. We also glimpse how strangers themselves made spaces multilingual. How their voices and languages became part of the urban speechscape to be heard and interpreted by Londoners in all their diversity. Early modern London was multilingual, and in fact it was much more multilingual than I've been able to talk about today. Not far from where Philippine Seneschal and her mother-in-law insulted each other in French and English, two men named Manteo and Wanchese were teaching their Algonquin language to Thomas Harriot. London's migrants spoke Welsh and Irish as well as French and Dutch. One commentator described the city as England's third university, where you could learn Chaldean, Syriac and Arabic, as well as Polish, Persian and Russian, among diverse other languages fit for ambassadors and orators, for agents, for merchants and for travellers, and necessary for all commerce or negotiation whatsoever. The Stranger Church's records testify to the presence in London of Turks and Swedes, Spaniards, Germans and Greeks. And the voices of the city's small but growing African population no doubt brought new languages to London's streets, even if we lack the detailed and linguistically rich archives we're lucky to have for these other groups of strangers. But that London was multilingual shouldn't come as a great surprise. What I really want to show with this lecture is that London was multilingual for everyone who lived there. It didn't matter if you didn't socialise with merchants, ambassadors and translators. It didn't matter if you were illiterate. And it didn't matter if you only spoke English. London was multilingual for everyone. Languages other than English could be heard on the streets and in the public spaces of the city, through the walls of homes and the doors of shops. And native Londoners, which is a problematic term anyway, experienced and engaged with other languages and with the information that they carried in ways that were active, not passive. When the bookseller Thomas Harris stopped his French neighbour Jean de Savoie in the street, it was because he wanted to know what had been said in the noisy French language row he'd overheard in the street. It wasn't necessary to speak or understand another language to be part of this multilingual urban culture. Your rowing neighbours might switch languages to ensure the cause of the trouble was made clear, or the offender might show up on your doorstep in the presence of an elder of their church to explain and apologise. Everyday translations like this were everywhere, making multilingual communication possible at every level of urban life, from the interpersonal to the institutional. Because so much of what we know about multilingualism in early modern Europe reflects the multilingualism of elites, it's possible to fall into the trap of believing that multilingualism was an elite phenomenon. It's even possible in 2023 to fall into the trap of believing that multilingualism in the UK is an elite phenomenon. From educational travel to literary translation, we have a well-documented and thoroughly studied understanding of how those who were wealthy and literate lived, thought, read and wrote multilingually. But the records of these stranger churches remind us that multilingualism was not and is not an elite experience alone. Our understanding of linguistic diversity in the early modern world, and specifically of its implications, is still, I think, at a relatively early stage, especially when it comes to linguistic diversity as it was experienced and practiced beyond elites. In a study of multilingualism in the early modern Mediterranean, Eric Derstler has argued that as the heirs of linguistic nationalism, it's difficult for us to conceive of a context in which multilingualism was the norm, where there were no efforts to impose linguistic homogeneity, and in which language was a marker of identity, but not to the exclusion of other elements. The early modern world, Derstler writes, was a linguistically richer and more complex age than our own, and this was accepted and even celebrated as the norm, rather than being perceived as disorientating. And this is at least partially true, even somewhere like London or England, often thought of too simply as effectively monoglot. Histories of early modern migration have too often, I think, treated language as a bit of an afterthought when they discuss it at all, which leaves a range of questions to be asked about how the experience of communicating across linguistic barriers shaped migrant mobilities and the polyglot communities in which they settled. And London wasn't unique, far from it. Just 100 miles northeast in the second city of 16th century England, Norwich's stranger population was much bigger as a proportion of the city's inhabitants than London's, and it's been described as working as a functionally trilingual city. Around the early modern world, urban life was shaped, and the urban experience was shaped by linguistic diversity. In Venice, a panic spurred by multilingual migrants led to a crackdown on blasphemy and illicit speech. In Granada, the relationship between Arabic and Spanish shaped the post-conquest city. In Algiers, a pidgin language emerged to facilitate conversations between Christians and Muslims. In Mexico City and Lima, notaries pondered how to establish new systems of trust and legality in the context of the interaction between Spanish and the indigenous languages of America. And a city like Banten, in what's now Indonesia, was somewhere that Japanese and Chinese were spoken alongside Malay, Gujarati, English, Dutch, Spanish, and many more. So I could go on, I really could. But the reason I'm bringing in these different examples is to argue that linguistic diversity was a key component of urban life in the early modern world. Histories of migration and histories of the city have long recognized the importance of diversity and difference in early modern cities. But I think we need to look much more closely at the role of language and multilingualism in many of these crowded and noisy environments. We need a global comparative conversation which will explore how cities made modern languages and how linguistic diversity shaped the city at a crucial moment in its history. In the latter decades of the 16th century, London's strangers' voices mingled audibly with the other words and languages of the city, shaping a multilingual oral culture which had to be navigated by Londoners and strangers alike. How they lived and communicated in a multilingual city has implications for our understandings of honour and assimilation, of community and coexistence, of xenophobia and identity. And to think about linguistic difference and languages in contact may be to rethink what we know of the social history of the early modern city. Thank you all very much.